Good morning. Do you belong to God? Do you believe God has a plan for your life? If your answer is yes, then why give the devil credit for the things that happen to you? If God really does have a plan for your life, can anything that happens to you be random? I was reading the Bible the other day and realised what an incredible start in life Moses had. As a Hebrew baby boy, he should have been destroyed. It was the commandment of the Pharaoh himself. But the child's mother would have none of that, king or no king. She fought for the life of her child and managed to hide him for 3 months, as he was a good baby and he didn't fuss. But when she realistically saw she could no longer hide him, Jochebed, his mother, made a little wicker basket which she daubed with pitch. She placed her baby in the basket and set it in the midst of the reeds on the river Nile. Then she let go and committed her child's future to God. Now, another woman comes on the scene. This time it's the daughter of Pharaoh, the very man who'd given the commandment to destroy all the baby boys 2 years old and under. She came to bathe in the Nile and saw the little wicker basket. When she opened it, lo and behold, she saw a little hungry, crying Hebrew baby and had compassion on it. She knew what her father had commanded, but something rose up inside her too, which made her want to fight for this child's life. Miriam, the baby's older sister who'd been told to watch out for her little brother, she saw the whole scenario, and she rushed forward to ask if she should find a wet nurse for the baby. When the princess gave permission, she ran home to fetch their mother. Miraculously, Jochebed, Moses' mother, was now paid by Pharaoh's daughter to take Moses to her family home and breastfeed him until he was weaned. Thank God for these 2 women who defied the ungodly commandments of the Pharaoh. Without them, we wouldn't have a Moses. What risks they both took. What the devil meant for evil, God completely turned around and used for good, placing Moses in a privileged and protected place where he was nourished with the finest foods and education. But when God called Moses at the age of 80, it almost seems like he didn't know God. Sure, he knew he was a Hebrew as he'd been circumcised by his parents. He probably knew about God because his parents were certainly God-fearing people who disobeyed Pharaoh's commandment to have Moses destroyed when he was a baby. His mother, who was employed by the Pharaoh's daughter to wet nurse him, would surely have wanted her child to know about God, especially knowing that after she'd weaned him, he'd be brought up in an Egyptian palace. But when he ran away from Egypt at the age of 40 after killing an Egyptian taskmaster, he not only lived with a Midian priest, he married his daughter. Moses was a man of destiny, but he was surrounded by many false and foreign gods. You know, when you've been chosen by Jehovah, there's something inbuilt which can discern his voice above all other voices. You may not have been properly introduced to him, but something in your spirit knows him. Moses was 80 years old when God called him to do a specific task. Yet Moses asked, "When I come to the children of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they say to me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them? Who are you?" He didn't have a personal relationship with Jehovah. Yet for 80 years, God had been working on him and preparing him for this job. Moses didn't know God, but God knew Moses. That's the amazing thing about God. He's totally in control and always working towards fulfilling his plan. He'd singled out Moses to speak with Pharaoh from his very birth. In Exodus 3, we read that Moses turned aside to see why a burning bush wasn't being consumed. And the Lord God called to him out of the midst of the bush, and he said, "Moses, Moses, I'm the God of your father." Wow! Fancy God saying that. Even though Moses was brought up as Pharaoh's grandson, he'd lived with his real family for maybe 5 or 6 years before going to live at the palace. And he knew his real father Amram. as Amram was 137 when he died. Amram was from the tribe of Levi and was a very God-fearing man who would have packed into little Moses as much as he possibly could whilst he lived with them. His older son, Aaron, actually became the very first high priest, and those who succeeded him were priests after the order of Aaron. The Bible records that when Moses was grown, even while he was still living in Egypt, he went out unto his brethren and he looked out on their burdens. He knew he was one of them. Yet God didn't reveal himself to Moses until he was 80 years old. I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Well, after hearing that, Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. We all have one thing in common with Moses. Having a knowledge of God isn't enough. We need to get to know him personally. Otherwise, we'll always be grieving our past instead of realising there's a divine reason for all the events which have taken place in our lives. And we'll continually be fighting what God's trying to do in us. God had a purpose for Moses, but he couldn't fulfil it until his character had been changed. The circumstances surrounding my birth weren't normal either, as I had the umbilical cord wrapped round my neck. If the devil had got his way, I would have been strangled at birth. When the doctor did cut the cord to free me, he accidentally snipped my mother's womb, causing terrible internal complications. She had 3 major operations to correct the problems, but none of them were successful. Mum was placed on the hospital records as having an incurable condition and lived in constant pain. Cutting me free caused awful pain for my mother. It wasn't until I was 9 years old that God revealed himself to my mum and dad. And the very first time they went to church, my mum was prayed for, and she was miraculously healed. The doctors could not believe the transformation. Some years ago, my pastor preached a sermon showing how the lives of people in the Bible were actually prophetic. Moses had been delivered out of the water when he was a baby, but later on, he delivered the children of Israel out of Egypt by taking them all through the water. And it made me think about how my journey began. I've come to realise that what my pastor preached was true. Our lives are prophetic. God has needed to cut me free from things many times. I'm not saying that that's the sole purpose for why I was born, but God has shown through the way I was born that this is one of the most effective ways that he deals with me. Maurice and I were in a music band for many years and we did lots of touring. Because of this, we took out an expensive insurance policy to cover our musical equipment all over Europe. One morning as we were praying, Maurice informed me that our insurance cover had run out and we needed money that very day to renew the policy. Well, I didn't have money and neither did he, and because I felt that this was really important, I prayed boldly in real faith that God would supply our need today. I then went off to the recording studio as I was booked for a jingle singing session. Normally, we were paid at the end of the month, but for some reason the producers said they wouldn't be around when the pay was due, so they paid us that very day, which meant that I came back to Maurice waving a big fat cheque, our miraculous answer to prayer, and we renewed our insurance cover. Well, some months later, we'd set our equipment up in a church after the Sunday morning meeting, and then we went home for our meal. When we arrived back at the church before the evening meeting, we found that not only had the church been broken into, but all our instruments had been stolen. It was very inconvenient at the time, but we weren't too worried as we were insured, or thought we were. The insurance company found a loophole in the fine print and they wouldn't pay out. I was devastated, especially as God had done a miracle to provide the money for the insurance cover in the first place. Well, I immediately wrote off all insurance companies, calling them all thieves. But Maurice got a different message, which I got later on. He saw clearly how ridiculous and hypocritical it was to trust the world to protect us when we told everyone we were serving the living God. You know, this was a major step forward where living by faith was concerned. We brought our need to God and he provided us with more equipment, but this time We didn't insure it. But it was whilst I was pregnant with my first child that Maurice and I were invited to have Sunday dinner with the minister of a church where we'd just preached. The pastor brought in a suit jacket and asked Maurice to try it on. It fitted him perfectly. So the pastor ran back upstairs and brought down the trousers to go with that jacket, plus 7 other suits. And amazingly, they all fitted him, except for the fact that I had to let the trousers down 1 inch. Now, at this point, we classed ourselves as musicians. We went about doing concerts and would both weave our message of discipleship in between songs. Because we saw ourselves as musicians, I made Maurice bright, frilly shirts made of the same material as my dresses. But for some time, God had been telling Maurice that he needed to smarten up and become more serious. Maurice didn't even have 1 tie in his wardrobe. Well, a couple of months later, Maurice and I were on holiday when we received a phone call informing us that we'd been robbed and all our musical equipment had been stolen. We looked at one another and knew that this wasn't a coincidence, as God knew we had no insurance. So there was no plan B. We just prayed together and asked, "Why have you allowed this, Lord? What do you want us to do now?" And God told us. He said he'd taken from us what we didn't need, because to bring in the new, he had to take out the old. Then he said to Maurice, "Now will you preach?" Well, God didn't take away our musical equipment. He took our old ministry away and he redirected us into a new one, where Maurice was to be known as a man of God rather than an entertainer. Maurice had known what God wanted for a while. He'd heard the call. But just like Moses, who'd said, "Lord, not me, I'm slow of speech, choose someone else," Maurice had done the same. He feared being a man of God, as he'd seen the way his father, who had been a real man of God, how he'd lived, and he did his best to avoid it. He knew the cost. But if God has a plan for your life, there is no such thing as a random coincidence. Everything that happens in your life is meant to direct you into that purpose. For us, we've decided to trust God and have no plan B. We've made the declaration that if we can prove by our lives that our God is worth serving, despite the circumstances, then our lives will have been well spent. You may be bewildered by things which happen in your life. But if you believe with all your heart that you belong to God, and you believe with all your heart that God has a plan for your life, then stop giving the devil credit for the unsavoury things which happen to you. You know, if you accredit all the blessings to God and accredit all the tragedies to Satan, it means you have 2 gods controlling your life, one for the good things and one for the bad things. Job said, "What? Shall we not receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil?" So, as Joshua said, choose you this day whom you will serve. Our main purpose in life is to have a real relationship with Almighty God, not just to have knowledge of him, and to have only one God. So instead of mourning your upbringing and background, look to see what God is prophesying through it. Learn to recognize and appreciate the way God deals with you. One revelation of God's divine purpose for you could change the rest of your walk with him. God bless you.